to learning about the state budget from Reaching Higher, New Hampshire. I'm going to keep introductory comments to a minimum because we have a lot to share today, and you're here to learn about the budget. But our policy team at Reaching Higher New Hampshire has been deep at work, immersed in the developments of the state budget, and are really looking to share out our findings and our analysis. But before we jump in, just a reminder of who Reaching Higher New Hampshire is. We are the state's education policy resource center, and we really pride ourselves on that. And all of our work centers on the notion that all children in our state deserve access to a high quality, rigorous, student-centered education that prepares them for life, college, and careers. So on that note, I am going to pass this off to Christina, who's going to walk you through the state budget and implications for the biennium of 24-25.
Great. Thanks so much, Nicole. And thank you everyone for being here. These are very exciting times in the state. Everything is moving really fast, but we really wanted to take this time to really unpack what is in the House Finance Committee's proposal. This is the proposal that will be going before the full House chamber on Thursday for a vote. And it has some really significant implications for education in there. The four main themes that we'll be talking about today are the WEYLER Amendment, which are changes to the Education Trust Fund and the state's contribution to that fund. We're going to be talking about school vouchers. There are some really significant changes, proposed changes in the House Finance Committee's proposal, some changes to the school funding formula, and then talking a little bit about what's next and sort of the next step of the budget process. So just as a brief overview, to date, the governor introduced his proposal in February. It was delivered to the House. The House took it up, the House Finance Committee, and then Division 2, which is a subcommittee of that full Finance Committee, really took a number of weeks to work through the education components of it. They went sort of line by line of House Bill 1 and House Bill 2. They made a number of proposed amendments. Those amendments were adopted as part of the House Finance Committee's full proposed package. And that package, that amendment, HB 1 and HB 2 as amended, are going before the House on Thursday. So we've been seeing a lot of discussion statewide about, what's happening, some negotiations, some reports and that kind of thing. So we're really going to break down the education components here, starting with what we're calling is the WEYLER Amendment. So the House Finance Chair, Ken WEYLER, he is a state rep from Kingston. He introduced this amendment to Division 2 a couple of weeks ago, and it has some very significant implications for the state's education trust fund now and in the future. We're calling it the WEYLER Amendment because he was the sole author of the amendment. He was the one who proposed it to Division 2, and it's a way to sort of think about it rather than Amendment 1150H. It's a little bit easier to understand and to kind of follow. So in starting with that, the amendment, quickly, we're just going to go over the Education Trust Fund and why it's important. So the state of New Hampshire has two funds, the general fund, which funds most programming, and then the Education Trust Fund, which is really a set aside to fund the state's public education system. So there are a number of pieces that the Education Trust Fund currently funds. It funds adequacy, so school funding for public district schools and for charter schools. Right now it funds school building aid. It funds the low and moderate income property tax relief and a number of other things. How it's funded, you can see here, and this slide is from the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. They are experts at everything in revenue and taxes and that kind of thing. So we really rely on them for that end of the thing. But you can see here, I really want to draw your attention to the orange slice, the business enterprise slice. the business enterprise tax slice, and then the business profits tax slice, which is red. So about $250 million in business enterprise tax, $124 million in business profits tax is what really, those are two big pieces that fund the Education Trust Fund in 2021. The WEYLER amendment does change that a bit in terms of how much money goes in from those two specific sources. So the amendment, and the House Finance Committee did adopt this amendment as part of their broader funding package, their broader budget package. It reduces the state contribution to the Education Trust Fund and nearly eliminates the fund's surplus by the end of fiscal year 2025, which is June 30th, 2025, 2 school years if we're thinking that way, ahead. So the next biennium. It moves funding of key programs to the general fund. So the school building aid program, special education aid. It's important to note here that this is not adequacy-based funding. It's not that roughly $1,900 per student. This is the special education aid that was formerly known as catastrophic aid. So that's when the state sort of steps in if student costs for special education services exceed a certain amount. So school building aid, special education aid, and career and technical education funding for tuition and transportation would be moved to the general fund. Those pieces, which are currently funded from the Ed Trust Fund, would shift out to be funded through the general fund. And so this is really impactful, not only in terms of the state contributions, and in the next slide, we'll see sort of the history of the Education Trust Fund and why this is really important, but moving those programs, those 3 programs right now, that is really important. Representative WEYLER had said when he introduced the amendment that, these programs historically had been funded from general funds, and he wants to return those back to being funded through general funds so that they can, quote, compete with other state priorities. This is critical. Special education aid, that catastrophic aid, has traditionally always been fully funded, but things like school building aid and CTE, we can expect to be a little bit more at risk, as if you'll remember, the school building aid program was on a moratorium for about a decade when it was funded through the general fund. And so moving that back to the general fund with a lot of other competing priorities, that's something that we'll be watching really closely. But if we want to take just a quick minute to look through the Education Trust Fund balance and how this WEYLER amendment may change that. So if you look, and there's a lot of data here, but I think the main points are, if we look at 2023 right here, and the asterisk means that these are expected. This is not historical data. We're not at the end of the fiscal year yet, and then 24 and 25 are obviously projections. But right now we're expected to end this fiscal year with $184 million surplus. And that is a sizable surplus over the past 2 or 3 years. The Education Trust Fund has had a pretty substantial surplus. Historically, before 2018, the Education Trust Fund actually ran a deficit. And so general funds would have to come back and sort of backfill that. That is really, really important for a number of reasons. Having that general fund have to backfill that, that has implications not only for education, but for all of the other programs, the other state programs that the general fund funds, because if the general fund has to backfill, that leaves less money in the general fund for other priorities. And so when we're thinking about, how much money are we putting into the Education Trust Fund, that's something else that's really, really important. So, over the next biennium, that 2024-2025, the WEYLER amendment would reduce the state's contribution to the fund by about $450 million. So that's almost $500 million. That's really, really important because, the Education Trust Fund, not only does it fund adequacy payments, those public school and charter school payments, it funds the school voucher program. It funds other priorities as well. And having that surplus, is when we think about school funding conversations now and in the future, that fund is really important when we put these things into context. So you'll see here in 2020, the state had about a $60 million surplus, and you'll see that number went down to about $2 million surplus. The legislature, lawmakers at that time used that surplus funding to fund $100 million relief package for high need communities. And so, lawmakers have used surpluses in the past to really deliver property tax relief, more funding for high need schools. And so, if we're reducing that to zero, how will that impact future conversations about school funding? It's something that we are watching really, really closely, especially as the state is facing a lawsuit against the school funding formula from both taxpayers and from school districts and school leaders. And so, we're really keeping that in mind. I do just want to very briefly say that these figures here are from the LBA's figures on March 28th. So I think Matt may have dropped in some links in terms of our content, and you might see that the numbers differ a little bit. Those numbers were based on older numbers. These were just hot off the presses right last week. So here's what we can kind of see. But we see in 2025, under the WEYLER amendment, which is the current amendment that is in the House Finance proposal, we see that the education trust fund surplus is zeroed out. So they're moving that money from the education trust fund, that $183 million from that trust fund, into the general fund to fund other priorities. And so, looking at this, it's important to know whether this move is sustainable, because you'll see, it zeroes out the surplus by FY25. What happens after that? Are we moving into a place where we're going to require general funds to backfill the education trust fund again so that we can pay for adequacy payments for public schools and for public charter schools? Are we going to need general funds to support the statewide school voucher program? All of these other things. So we're really asking, is this sustainable? Because there is no sunset clause at this moment that we know of. Would this make the education trust fund more of a pass-through fund rather than a designated fund that those funds are set aside for education? That's a really important thing when we're talking about, the value that we have for our schools and for our students. As I'd mentioned, this can significantly impact future discussions of school funding. And the amendments move of those key programs, that school building aid, that special education aid, and the CTE funding, having that compete with general funds, how is that going to impact those programs? Could that put some of those programs in jeopardy? Could we see a moratorium like we did in the past? Where are we looking for? And during Representative WEYLER's introduction of the amendment, Representative Mary Heath had made this really good point that I think really sums up some of the considerations that people are talking about. And she had said, how would it look to the courts to be taking money from the trust and, encouraging us to look at this proposal in terms of how the courts will perceive these actions? I think that's really important. The court case is still pending. Would this open the state up even more? I'm not sure. But I think it's really important to think about when we think about not only the state's legal obligation to fund public schools and really thinking about what's best for students and schools in our communities. So switching gears a little bit, and sorry, we are going a little quickly because there's just so much to cover, but we're going to shift gears a little bit to changes to the statewide school voucher program. And just to start off, we just wanted to take a minute to show what the New Hampshire Department of Education request was. So their request, they submitted this request late last year in December. They presented their proposed budget to a panel of budget writers. The red line here, this is the initial estimates that the New Hampshire Department of Education had in their long-term modeling. when lawmakers were considering even passing the statewide voucher program. So they had expected, the cost at the first year to be $129,000. It ended up costing $8 million. In 2023, they expected it to cost about $3 million. It actually cost close to $15 million. And so now we see that they are estimating that the cost will double from this year to about $30 million in FY24 and FY25. You can see that is quite a bit larger than their initial estimates of 15.4 million and 18.1 million. But they are assuming a doubling of participation in the program. It is really important to know, and I'm going to say this a couple of times throughout this particular section, but it's so important that the New Hampshire Department of Education, they can estimate how much the program will cost. They can, toss out a number, they can estimate, they can think about, but at the end of the day, the state is responsible for 100% of the cost, even if it goes over budget. So they had submitted the $29.9 million. It does not mean that once that number of requests come in, that they can't accept anymore. If an application for a school voucher is eligible, it must be funded. So it could go under that $29.9 million per year. It could go over. There's no way to know. And currently there's no cap that sets it to that number. It's really whatever it will cost. And so on that note, that $29.9 million per year, that $60 million over the biennium, that, to our knowledge, I've asked for clarification and I haven't received it yet, but that assumes doubling of the program, so twice as many students next year participating under the current funding formula. However, the House proposal, as we'll see later, but the House proposal, the House Finance funding formula increases base adequacy. It increases funding streams for students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. It increases funding for students who qualify for special education services, and it increases funding for students who are in English language learner programs. It eliminates funding for third grade reading, but there weren't many students who qualified for that who participated in the school voucher program anyway, so that didn't have as big of an impact. But really what we are seeing here is this increase right here, the increase in base adequacy from about $3,900 to $4,700. And so, if the Department of Education is expecting twice as many students to participate next year, that the true cost of school vouchers is actually going to be closer to $37,000. Given the proposed formula increases, what we are anticipating is that the actual cost, assuming that same enrollment by the New Hampshire Department of Education, assuming no expansion, which is really important as well, it will actually be about $7 million higher per year than the New Hampshire Department of Education's estimates. I do want to say here that House Bill 1 does not reflect this increase. House Bill 1 includes the $29.9 million per year. It does not include that higher number. But like I said earlier, if the request, if a family requests a school voucher and they are eligible for the program, that voucher must be funded, whether or not it goes above or over the department's request on HB1. So over the biennium, we see the New Hampshire Department of Education requested about $60 million. But our prediction is that it's probably with all of the changes proposed by the House Finance Committee, it would actually be closer to $75 million over the biennium. That's $15 million more. And that's before any expansions. And I reiterating this a little bit, we've seen over the weekend, there've been some negotiations in public. We've seen letters come from various party leaders on both sides of the aisle, but House Republican leadership has said that they'd be willing to adjust the EFA line, that school voucher line, to $20 million per year in HB1. But it's important to know that under current law, every eligible voucher request must be funded. So they can put it to $20 million. But if demand exceeds that, it has to be funded. So I think that's something that's really important when we think about negotiations and where the budget is going to land. That's really, really important. And I think what's also really important is to know that currently 77% of the public funds are being sent to students who were already enrolled in private schools or were homeschooled. So 77% of those funds are actually new funding. That's new state spending, because those students were not funded from adequacy funding or anything like that. That is new state spending. And so that's also really important when we think about, the cost of school vouchers now and the cost of school vouchers in the future, if they're expecting the number of students participating to double. So that's, that $15 million increase is just under current assumptions. The House Finance Committee's recommended budget includes an unprecedented expansion to the statewide school voucher program. And that's for two reasons. So the House Finance Committee is recommending an increase in the income eligibility cap from 300% of the federal poverty guideline to 350% of the federal poverty guideline. So they're folding in that House bill that was passed by the House recently. And then they're also recommending a categorically universal expansion. And we'll get a little bit more into that, what that means. But that one is major. That is a really critical piece of this puzzle for now and beyond. So taking just a minute to look at the income eligibility increase, the House's proposal includes that House bill, which increases income eligibility threshold for all students. So for a family of four currently, the income cap would be $90,000, a family household income of $90,000, increasing that to 350% of the federal poverty guideline. That's $105,000. And so you can see a little bit here, the other household, because it does change based on household size. According to statewide census data, about 36% of school-aged youth live in households at or below 300% of the federal poverty guideline. Unfortunately, I cannot, the census data is 300% or 400%, so I can't really draw any conclusions, but about half of students live under 400% of the federal poverty guideline, which we see here. So we can see about 65,000 school-age youth in New Hampshire, and that little bar is the margin of error. There is a margin of error here. About 65,000 school-aged youth in New Hampshire live under 300% of the federal poverty guideline. About 88,000 live under 400% of the federal poverty guideline. So it is not linear. So I would caution anyone in drawing any conclusions as to, would 350% be about here? We can't say that for sure at this time. I might be able to do a little bit more digging of the data, but I have not been successful there yet. But it is expected to be a pretty sizable increase in the eligibility criteria. However, not as large as the other half of the expansion proposal, which is a categorically universal school voucher program. So this eliminates the income eligibility requirements for these subsets of students. So students who live in the geographic boundary of a designated school, students who have a manifest education hardship, all students with disabilities, students who live in foster care or who are experiencing homelessness, persistently bullied students, students eligible for school meals, students in military families, English language learners, and this is regardless of their family income. So, for students who don't fall within these subcategories, under the House Finance proposal, if their family income is at or less than 350% of the federal poverty guideline, but for these students, there is no income eligibility requirement. And this is really important, particularly for the geographic boundary piece, because there is no definition of what geographic boundary means. And this is extremely important when we think about where these designated schools are. So these designated schools are CSI schools. These are continuous support and improvement schools. They either are at the bottom 5% of statewide testing, or they have relatively low graduation rates for a number of years in a row. And so these are really of the school, many CSI designated schools are charter schools. And that opens up a lot of questions. There is, is it if a student lives within the geographic boundary of where a charter school is located? There are charter schools in Keene, in Rochester, in Derry, Concord, Lebanon, Littleton, Conway, if they live within those boundaries. But also, charter schools have open enrollment, which complicates it even further. And this is especially important when we talk about VLAX. So VLAX is our state's only approved online charter school. Every student in New Hampshire is eligible to take VLAX courses. And so since all of those students are eligible, would every student in New Hampshire be eligible for a school voucher regardless of income because of this? This is a question that we have asked over and over again. We have not received a response, but it is a piece that is extremely concerning because there is there is no clarity around what a geographic boundary means. And so, we are really concerned about this because it could open up the school voucher program, to be actually a universal school voucher program. Even if we assume that charter school eligibility is not included, the state's largest school districts, Manchester, Nashua, have CSI designated schools within their geographic boundaries. Of these, without the asterisk, these are CSI designated schools that are not charter schools. There are about 26,000 additional public school students who live in those school districts, who are assigned to those school districts. However, it's really important to know that there is no clarity around this. So if charter school students are eligible, that means that VLAX is a CSI designated school. That could mean that all students in New Hampshire would be eligible. And if that were the case, then the school voucher program could cost about $78 million per year for existing private school students alone. There are about nearly 17,000 private school students in the state. And assuming that they would take a school voucher because it would be universal eligibility, that would cost the state $78 million per year in new state spending because they are not, they don't receive adequacy. So this would be solely new funding. This number does not include, this is only base adequacy, that $4,700 per student. It doesn't include extra aid for students who qualify for special education services. It does not include payments for free and reduced lunch students. It does not include extra funding for students who are in English language learner programs. This is just base adequacy. This is just for existing private school students. This is this would be, if this were the case, a massive expansion of school vouchers. And it's especially concerning when we think about some of the concerns that we've heard about school vouchers over, really for a number of years, but they've been really heightened since the school voucher program was implemented in 2021. There are concerns both in New Hampshire, and I think we're seeing this play out right now in real time, and nationally, that school vouchers do in fact siphon funding away from public schools. We see this here and now with the estimated $75 million over the biennium that the school voucher program could cost. And then we heard in Division 2, there were concerns over school building aid. They cut it by $75 million because they didn't have the money for it, but we're spending that money in school vouchers. So we're seeing that siphoning away from public schools. We're seeing that in real time. There are concerns about the accountability to the public. The use of public dollars with zero accountability. Students aren't required to take the annual statewide assessment. Parents are not required to submit report cards, progress reports, graduation rates, any other indicator of academic progress to the state. So we don't know how these students are doing. We don't know where their areas for growth are, or if these public funds are being used in ways that help them learn, grow, and really thrive. Education providers are not required to submit any details on program offerings, curriculum, practices, or other details. There are no guardrails to protect students and families. There's very limited transparency. Expecting a performance audit in October from the state LBA to see how the Department of Education is monitoring access spending and phase out grants. We don't have any idea right now. In fact, in front of the House Education Committee, the representative from the Children's Scholarship Fund had expressed dismay that, through hours and hours of presentation from the New Hampshire Department of Education, the department hadn't given them any reports in terms of fiscal reports, vendor reports, expense reports. The department hasn't shared those with lawmakers. And even still, that representative did say that she would make a report, give them a report. And to our knowledge, that report hasn't been given. So really, we're not really seeing anything here. We're not seeing any data. We're not seeing any reporting or anything like that. So there's very little transparency, very little accountability in the program, which raises a number of questions, especially if, as we expect, these voucher expansions would make the program universal. And so going in now, we're just going to review a couple of changes to the school funding formula. So we talked about, the revenue streams for the Education Trust Fund. We talked about the school voucher expansion, and now we're going to dive into the school funding formula itself. And so just to start off, the current school funding formula has base aid. So that's per student aid. Every student in the state receives this aid if they're in a public district school or public charter school. And it's about $3,900 per year in FY24. If students qualify for any of these funding streams, these are called differentiated aid. So free and reduced lunch is for students who are experiencing poverty, special education aid if the students qualify for special education services, ELL aid for students who are receiving English language learner services. And right now, third grade reading aid, which is if a student does not test at proficient by the time they are in third grade in reading, and they don't qualify for any of the other funding streams, their district receives $756 for them to help them provide reading services and that kind of thing. Right now, districts receive $17.5 million in relief grants, which are targeted at districts that have high concentrations of students experiencing poverty. $9.7 million in extraordinary need grants. And so these grants are based on both the proportion of students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, those students who are navigating poverty, coupled with the town's tax capacity. So, towns that have lower property wealth, they have, a more difficult time raising taxes to pay for their schools. And if they have high concentrations of student poverty, those are the districts that receive the extraordinary need grants. And then the stabilization grants, which is a static $157 million per year. This is really kind of what we call legacy grants. So these were implemented in 2012. They are based on 2006 numbers, but it's important to know here that the districts that receive stabilization grants are still districts that are in high need, which tells us that, you know, they may be based on old data, on past data, but the demographics of our communities really have not changed that much. Most of the districts that receive stabilization grants are districts that would receive things like relief grant. They would receive things like fiscal capacity disparity aid. So we're seeing that there hasn't really been a lot of change in demographics. When we look at the House Finance Committee's proposed budget, a few key pieces really pop out. The House Finance Committee is recommending an increase in base aid, free or reduced price lunch, special education, English language learner aid categories, and we'll see a little bit more in the next slide about that. It does include a 2% annual increase in the foundational formula in that base aid and categorical aid, that differentiated aid. And that replaces the biennial adjustment. So under current law, every new biennium, every 2 years, the formula is adjusted for inflation. And it's based on a factor, I think it's based on the CPI, which is the national sort of inflationary factor. This is a straight up 2% annual increase every year. Formerly, the extraordinary need grants would increase biannually until 2036. The House Finance Committee actually does not do that. So the extraordinary need grants, they've increased it in the first year in FY24, and then it's a 5% adjustment, 5% increase each biennium. So that bullet point is actually incorrect, and I'm very sorry about that. But it does eliminate stabilization grants, that $157 million. It does eliminate the relief grants, that $17.5 million. And it does eliminate the third grade reading differential, which statewide was about $2 million. It creates a hold harmless grant in 2024 with a 20% biennial phase out. So that will phase out to zero in the next 10 years. It's eliminated by 2034 and beyond. So what does that actually look like? Let's take a quick peek. So if we're comparing current law to the governor's proposal and to the House Finance proposal, the House Finance proposal and the governor's proposal, it increases the base aid to $4,700, $4,700. It increases the free and reduced price lunch to $2,500 for each student who qualifies. The House Finance proposal increases the special education differentiated aid by about $20 to an even $2,100. And then it does pretty much the same for the English language learner category from $756 to $800. And then like the governor's proposal, it eliminates the third grade reading differential. So we see, you know, most of it has been stuck the same. There were some tweaks in special education English language learner streams. We heard a lot of conversation about this in Division 2, in that House Finance subcommittee. There was a lot of conversation. There were a number of committee members who wanted to reduce the increase to base aid in order to provide more targeted funding. But at the end of the day, the majority of the committee voted to keep the governor's proposal to hold that base aid at $4,700. And so, you know, there were some tweaks to the targeted aid programs, which we'll see in a minute. But that's kind of what the conversations were in terms of the foundational formula. And so now looking at comparing the governor's proposal to the House Finance proposal, the governor's proposal increased the base adequacy and the free and reduced lunch. The House Finance proposal increased the 4 pieces. They both phase out the stabilization grant. They both eliminate the relief aid. But this is the big change here, the extraordinary need grant. So the governor's proposal, it keeps the same amount as current law, $9.7 million in FY24, and then it would increase to 50% each biennium until 2034. The House Finance proposal, however, does something a little bit different. It expands the program to $55.4 million in the first year, and then it sort of has that inflationary adjustment, that 5% biennial increase. And so, it's two different approaches. I think the rationale behind it is that by increasing extraordinary need grants in the first year, it provides more need-based funding in that first year, instead of having it sort of phase in and then having districts really rely on that hold harmless grant that's also kind of phasing out. So this was an important piece as well. And so when we look at the impact to the total estimated funding for public schools, the blue in 2024 here, $962 million is the current funding. So the House Finance proposal would increase that by about $73 million in that first year, which is a 7.5% increase. And then it averages at about 1.3% annual increase through FY 2034. This is really important because I think we've heard a lot about that 2% annual increase, but with the phasing out of the hold harmless grant, what we're really seeing the true impact being here is that essentially it's flat funded when you take into account inflation. So that's this 1.3 annual increase. These numbers are unadjusted for inflation. So we would expect to see pretty much a flat funding of schools, and that's assuming that there is no change in enrollment. So all of these figures are based on steady enrollment in every single school district, which we know that has not been the case in prior years. And so we would expect to see this fluctuate a bit. Something else that's, that I think is really important is that, this formula is still pretty heavy on the enrollment-based funding rather than the targeted need piece. And so, having most of the funding come from per student funding, it's going to make districts more vulnerable to shifts in enrollment. And so I think that's something that we should really consider as well going forward. And so when we look at the estimate of targeted funding in the next 10 years, in FY24 current law, I want to draw your attention here to this yellow line. And this is the current stabilization grant. So this is the current $157 million per year in stabilization. And we see that, the targeted funding year after year never quite matches the amount of just the stabilization grant. And I think that's really important when we're thinking about targeted funding, because we know, research has shown again and again how important that targeted funding is for high need school districts. That stabilization grant is, it is based on old data. It 100% is. It is based on data from 2006. It is a static grant, so it doesn't change year after year unless there are some changes in SWEPT, but that gets a little into the weeds. But we see that communities, they have pretty much the same demographics. They have pretty much the same needs. And so eliminating that stabilization grant without a direct replacement could put some districts, some schools, some communities in a tough spot. And so looking at this is taking out stabilization. This is just looking at the extraordinary need grant and the phase out of the hold harmless. So we can see here that, in 2025, those numbers, there's a little bit more hold harmless than there is extraordinary need grants. But over time, you can see how the hold harmless phases out. And then the extraordinary need grant sort of increases 5% each biennium. Members of the Division II Finance Committee pushed really hard for this. They worked really hard to ensure that, that extraordinary need grant was there in year one so that those districts could get the funding that they needed, that those districts who rely on extraordinary need get that funding in the long term. And I think that's really, really important to point out and really important to know going in. So if we look at that per student funding compared to need-based funding. Current formula, under the current law in 2024, about 16% of state dollars are based on need. About 84% are based on per student. So that's the adequacy funding. That is that base funding. That is the, the differentiated aid for free and reduced lunch, special education, English language learner. The need-based funding are the streams of stabilization, of the relief aid, and of the extraordinary need grant. So those are really based on community demographics. We see that once the House Finance Committee's formula is fully phased in 2034, that need-based aid is less than 6%. So the state is really heavily relying on that per student funding. And I think, what we know about school funding in general, that raises a lot of questions of, does moving to a per student funding formula put rural schools, put schools that maybe have more declining enrollment, does it put those schools at a disadvantage over rapidly growing schools, or schools that, even steadily grow? And in a state where we have steadily declining enrollment, what is that going to mean for our schools and for our communities? This is a really, really important piece of the puzzle that I think needs, we all need to be paying attention to it for sure. And so when we look at the town by town need-based funding in the House Finance Committee's formula, $55 million in extraordinary need. We see that the districts who would receive the largest extraordinary need grants include Manchester, Nashua, Rochester, Concord, Claremont, those districts that have low tax capacity and high concentrations of students who are experiencing poverty who qualify for free and reduced lunch programs. And so in this list are all of the districts who receive more than $1 million in extraordinary need. There are a number of other districts who are expected to receive smaller grants, but those are the big pieces. And so if we look at those towns and compare their current targeted funding under current law, the amount of need-based aid that they receive compared to the amount of need-based aid that they would receive under the House Finance Committee's proposal, we see that all of the funding phases out over time. And it also means that, if we look at the actual impact with the full impact, including the changes in the adequacy formula, we see that that increase in the base aid and the differentiated aid are offsetting the impacts of the reduction in need-based funding. And so, when we think about equitable funding, that's really important because, wealthier communities they're going to get that increase in base adequacy in the funding formula, and they don't have anything they don't need to offset that. So they're getting all of that, the benefit of that increase. Whereas places like Manchester, Nashua, Rochester, Concord, they have to rely on that increase to offset this reduction in targeted aid. And that is critical for a number of reasons, requiring that they rely on that adequacy funding to offset the targeted aid. These are our communities who are in the most need. These communities have high concentrations of students who are navigating poverty. Their students have bigger barriers to overcome in order to come to school and really engage in their schools. We know that targeted resources are critically important to these high need communities. And so, we're asking them to do a lot with, frankly, less money. It's especially important when we think about Keene, who's expected to receive about 54% less in targeted funding. Rochester, 38% less. Somersworth, 49% less in targeted funding. This targeted funding is important. It is necessary in order to provide, equal opportunities, equitable outcomes for students. And so this is a section that's really, really, really important. And it's something that I do really kind of want to double down on. And, funding our schools, funding them fairly and funding them adequately, it isn't an either or scenario. It's not either looking at the per student funding or looking at targeted aid. Schools, New Hampshire schools in general, they need both base funding, that adequacy funding, and need-based funding. We know that need-based funding is really one of the most critical strategies to improving opportunities and outcomes for students. We know that need-based funding works. And so when we look at the House Finance Committee's proposed formula, we see that, they went some way in addressing the base funding. They increased the adequacy, they increased that per student funding and that kind of thing. But it's the need-based funding that I think there's some room for improvement there. We know need-based funding works, but we see, our most vulnerable communities are expected to receive less need-based funding next year and over time. And so that's really, really important and a big consideration. And so looking at other budget highlights there, the House Finance Committee did make a number of other recommendations. They did recommend to remove the $75 million school building aid fund. And that would have been allocated at the end of FY25. That would have been a separate fund. They removed that because they didn't feel that there was enough money to support that. And just to kind of circle back, I do want to call this out. They did say, that there wasn't funding for it, but when we look at the cost of school vouchers, having that be about $75 million over the biennium, we're really seeing in real time the siphoning of those public funds. And so that's really, really important. The House Finance Committee added New Hampshire Department of Education administrative fees. So on top of the funding that the New Hampshire Department of Education gets as part of their agency budget for staffing, for those kinds of things, they were allocated about $7 million in administrative fees over the biennium. The House Finance Committee is recommending that the computer science investment that was included in the governor's proposal stay. They added an administrative staff person at the New Hampshire Department of Education. The governor did recommend $2 million to revamp a civics curriculum and create a civics textbook. The funding for that and the textbook part were removed under the House Finance Committee's proposal. I did see this morning that there is an amendment that I believe they'll be considering on the floor that would put back that $2 million and put back that civics textbook, that New Hampshire-based civics textbook. But as of right now, the House Finance Committee proposal does not include that $2 million. It does increase, the recommendation is to increase charter school funding as part of House Bill 272. And then the House Finance Committee is recommending an increase in the dual and concurrent enrollment scholarships. So under current law, students can take up to 2 courses per year of dual and concurrent enrollment. That's like Running Start, early college, those kinds of things. That would increase it from 2 courses in STEM or CTE to 5 courses in any field, which is really a huge advance. Like that's a big deal for our high school students. I took dual and concurrent enrollment courses when I was in high school. Earning college credit while you're in high school is an amazing thing for students. And so, to see that increase from 2 courses to 5 courses per year, and the expansion of the types of courses, that was a really big deal. And Division 2 was pretty excited about that piece. And so, looking at what's next, where do we go from here? Well, the House vote is scheduled for Thursday, April 6th, and it really is, according to news reports, it's an exciting day. Negotiations continue. If it passes, if HB1 and HB2 pass on Thursday, April 6th, the bills will go to the Senate Finance Committee. If it doesn't, you know, the House failed to pass a budget in 2017 for the first time in what I hear is decades. The Senate will start its own process of crafting a budget, and we'll sort of go from there. So, you know, April 6th, I'll be watching. It's live streamed on YouTube if anyone's interested in watching it, but those are, that's the next big step. And so, that's what I got. Just a plug to sign up for our email and for our network, the New Hampshire Education Network. We send out near weekly email updates during the legislative session, sort of saying, you know, these are the key things to know about last week. Here's what's coming up this week. So I would encourage people who are interested in these topics to sign up. And then the education funding, you know, our general newsletter that goes out monthly. And so, you know, if you're interested in getting that in your inbox, feel free to sign up for that. And then with that, you know, if anyone has any questions that they don't want to put or couldn't put in the chat, feel free to email me, Christina@reachinghighernh.org. And with that, I think I will turn it and see if from Matt and Nicole, if anyone had any questions.
Christina, that was excellent. And as always, just stellar and a lot of information within a 1 hour time period. So I think people were very appreciative. We were answering questions as in the chat as they appeared. We had a few comments. We didn't respond to comments today, but we did answer the questions that surfaced. I think just as a follow-up, you know, folks were asking and highlighting how important this information was and is, and that they were trying to take notes. So we will be following up with a posting of the webinar, a copy of the slide deck, and folks were also asking about additional data that we may have in our analysis that we can connect offline on. But all in all, a terrific presentation.
Great, thank you. Thanks, and thank you for being here, everyone. I really appreciate it. These are topics that are near and dear to all of our hearts. So I appreciate you being here. And with that, I think if anyone has anything last minute that they want to drop into the Q&A, please do so. Love to see it, love to hear it. And I hope everyone has a great afternoon. More to come, certainly, from Reaching Higher. Next week's legislative update will be a big one, so I would encourage everyone to sign up for the newsletter.
And a lot of appreciation is appearing in the chat, Christina.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry, I had to speak pretty quick to get through, but I'm glad I made it with like 5 minutes to spare, so that was good.
So yeah, looking at the chat, I think we can end the webinar and encourage people to go back to their day. And again, thank you for joining us.